Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, the curtain rose on Meridia, a fiery-tempered, fiery-haired Light Corpsman who's in hot pursuit of Val and the Machine King despite very little help from her fellow soldiers. How will she handle this escalating conflict on all sides? Well, find out next on the Seventh Valkyrie. Chapter 9. A Grinding Halt. Meridia, the 6th day of winter, at dawn. There were very few people in the new city that woke up earlier than Meridia did. And even if they were awake, there was no one who seized the pre-dawn hours with such vigor. In the years since the war, Meridia had never needed a crank alarm, a delay candle, or a night watchman to wake her up. Progressively, she had simply gotten up earlier and earlier until her family, and then later her squad mates, had begun to question if she ever really slept. Some people saw it as very convenient. Meridia had always been willing to help with a late night shift or an extra assignment. Some people spoke about her in awe, and tried for weeks to match her schedule before giving up. Some people, on the other hand, called her a freak. Behind her back, of course, because anyone who'd said it to her face would have faced a cold gaze and a challenge the next morning on the training grounds. But to Meridia, waking up early was simply the way things had to be. To honor even the shadow, even the boots of the Iron Wolf, you had to give all that you were to the cause, and that meant as much of every day as possible. Today, that endless drive and determination found Meridia clad in her heavy-weighted workout uniform, with her extra-weighted vest and full weapons strapped across her back as she ran her morning circuit of the new city. She would start by running down to the waterfront, then zigzag across each progressive level of the city, stopping at each stair to run an ascent and descent before continuing on. Morning runs of all sorts were another personal routine that had traced back to the days after the war, and had also gotten Meridia some notoriety throughout basic training. It had been viewed amongst the commanders and the cadets alike as nothing short of insane to wake up prior to basic training and do even more exercise. And yet, without fail, Meridia had gotten up and done so anyway. Even now, she got requests from all types to try to join her on her morning training. There were cocky jackasses, of course, earnest young recruits, people who'd lost bets, and the odd exceptional athlete who could keep up, at least for a little while. But they all fell behind eventually, and when they heard that she had spent the whole time in weighted vests and full gear, well, it only added to the reasons that she had become the first female Light Corpsman initiated since the war. Meridia gritted her teeth at the thought, which happened to coincide with the moment she passed under one of the upper gates, where the high officer quarters were. Yosin was in there somewhere, still asleep probably, but hidden underground. And even hidden underground, when he awoke, he would still somehow be looking down on her. That thought reinvigorated her tired legs, and she accelerated towards the bridge. She had overcome better men than Yosin to get here. Maybe today would be a double day of training. The sky had lightened considerably as she reached the edge of the bridge, where the Mandarian workers shipped in for the project were already starting their day. Or maybe they had been working through the night. Because the road had been closed, guard posts had been erected, and the enormous process of clearing earth and laying foundation was already well underway. Long before the war, the Mandarian crossing had been a marvel of the modern world, rising up from either shore at the center of the river on 3 massive pillars. There were rumors that it had only been completed with the help of the extra-naturals, the Thwarps, but any official report Meridia had read had no trace of any help from the other side of the river. It was all exclusively the work of superior Eteran engineering. Across the river, there was no trace of the old city pillar, not where it had stood nor anywhere else. The same could be said of the pillar that had once stood in the center of the Mandarian. Reports said that that had been turned to rubble and knocked down to expand the shipping lanes. But on the new city side, a pillar still stood, half crumbled where the other 2 had fallen, and still forming the foundations of one of the new city's walls. At least, that was how it had been when Meridia had gone to bed the night before. Now, in addition to all the progress starting as the men laid foundations to try to build out the bridge, there was another major addition. Edera's journey to reshape the mountainside and reshape the dynamics of Reen had already begun. Stretching out from riverbank to riverbank, the 6 barges that had come from the capital were chained sideways and locked to the new city side of the river by an ocean of pylons that were still being dug in and driven into the ground. On the old city side, the last barge was anchored by a thick cable going into the water. It must have been connected to some massive weight under the water's edge. And just like that, in a single night, the mouth of the Mandarian had been completely blockaded. Beyond the pylons on the new city side, there was more work being done. Fleets of oxen fought in the mud pulling long dredges, while a hive of engineers and other construction workers marked out borders and boundaries, shouting to other waterborne workers to measure lines and trace routes. It was a hive of activity, and if Meridia hadn't grown up on a river, she might not have recognized it. But there were all the signs that they were building another small harbor, this time upriver of the new barge line. Just what the hell were Yosun and Central planning? Meridia wasn't the only one to have questions. Even so early in the morning, vessels had already begun to arrive in Reen, both from up the river, coming from Mandus, and out from the open ocean. Only now, rather than moving freely, they hovered and clumped, passing word of the blockade and trying to figure out exactly how to continue. There were twice as many Edoran patrol boats out that morning, and they seemed eager to assist any Edoran boat, while most of the unidentified or Freelander vessels strayed away from the center of the river, cagily sticking to their side of the cove. Well, if Yosun and Central had wanted to ratchet tensions up even more, they had certainly succeeded. Filing this new information away, Meridia set back off through town, making her way back down the long rows of streets, uncompromising in her morning training as the sun began to crest over the mountains. The roads were abuzz, far more than she was used to for the first lap of a morning run, and the commotion only grew as she zigzagged back down through the city towards the docks to complete her first circuit. The Mandarians were out in force even through the city, but so too were Reen's home force of soldiers, as well as the shop owners and even the residents, huddled in doorways, passing glances and whispers back and forth. There were more cries of, "Hail Light Corps!" than she was used to, undercut with an air of gratitude and uncertainty. And by the time Meridia reached her home, she had slowed, spotting 2 fellow soldiers talking in hushed whispers as they shared a morning farette. Godan and Rem, their names were. Godan, the far larger of the two, was an armorsmith, and a decent one at that, who Meridia liked because he had begrudgingly started to acknowledge her after she had outlifted him in the training yards. Rem, meanwhile, worked in the stables and had the steady sense of men who were good with animals. Upon her arrival, Rem lifted his fist and nervously echoed the calls of "Hail Light Corps," followed closely by Godan. Meridia ground to a stop. Whole town's awake early, Meridia said. And we've got a kicked stinger's nest down by the river. Now I see you 2 up before first shift. What gives? The 2 shared an uneasy look. I don't like secrets, lads. Oh, no secrets, Godan said hastily. You must have missed the messengers. They came through the whole town a little while ago, talking about some sort of news. A bunch of raids all at once, he said, though that's all he told us. Meridia's stomach turned over. In the time it took Rem to muster up the guts to ask her if everything would be all right, she had breezed past them to her front door, opening it to find a wrapped message left for her. After taking a brief moment to give thanks that Yosun hadn't cut her off from information entirely, which would have been a direct violation of protocol, she tore open the message and blitzed over the pages. There had been 5 confirmed raids in a single evening, at Wharton, Westwatch, and in 3 suburbs of Mandus. Others were unconfirmed, and there were rumors of similar attacks at Vale, Benston, Eolon, and Minns. Minns. Swearing, her mind flashed back to the false wolf. Had he been telling the truth about the attacks? And if he was carrying verifiable intel, why had he come up with such an outlandish lie about his identity? Trauma? They were taught ever since the war that moments of extreme bravery were the Iron Wolf's will overtaking you, if only for a moment. Meridia had never experienced such a thing, but she had heard of it, and maybe that false wolf really had become convinced he was the Iron Wolf? There was no time to consider. There were other attacks, ones that had been thwarted, and further central to Edera, the military had mobilized and was in the process of tracking and crushing all of the raiders that they could find. But then there was the other file, on Sunsetten. According to the message from Central, something had happened at Sunsetten, but reports were unclear. Official investigators had been dispatched to the town, but it would take time to fully investigate what had happened in the city. Right now, all their communications had ceased. It was troubling, but for now, though, the directive was clear. All major cities were to elevate to threat level Bravo, effective immediately. Meridia swore, thinking back to the false wolf again and his declaration about the Machine King. Unease crept into Meridia. It was too coincidental for there not to be some connection, and if for a moment she let herself trust the words of the false wolf, they made some sort of sense. The men who they'd captured in the aftermath of the raid on the new city, the prison break, they had all been dead, or they'd committed suicide the moment they'd been caught. It was nearly impossible to prevent an extranatural from taking his own life if he wanted to, and something had scared them or invigorated them enough to die for their cause, keeping all their secrets with them. There was one thing clear, though. They had all worn the infinite gears of the Machine King. Yosin had laughed at her. Criminals and rebels playing dress-up to a myth, he said. But as Meridia finished reading the letter and stored it carefully in her files, she was filled with resolve. Coincidences happened, but they were rare. She would convince Yosin that whether the Machine King was a man, a monster, or an idea, he was a threat. And there was no one better to hunt him down than Meridia. Again, that false wolf jumped into her head, his warning and his lies twisting and turning and flipping around in her head. If she had him in her grasp now, she could figure it out, she was sure. But he had disappeared, leaving only questions in his place. Meridia moved on. In the time it took for her to clean up and prepare for the day, she had compiled the choice files from her research and the reports from the attack a few nights before, as well as the message she'd gotten from Central just this morning. With all that information, she wove together a plan and set out towards command. And as Meridia arrived at command, she found activity at a fever pitch. There was a clamor already from the additional men from the capital who'd arrived last night, and that was only compounded by the news of the attacks which seemed to fill the air. It was ricocheting from the lips of every third civilian she passed, and even more so from the soldiers rushing to prepare the city for an even higher state of alert. After the prison break, they'd lifted security around Reen to threat level Charlie, one above the new city's resting threat level of Delta. A normal city wouldn't have a threat level at all, but the old city was close here, and Reen, or the new city as it were, was always on watch. Elevation to threat level Bravo meant even tighter restrictions and even more eyes in every direction. There would be searches now for anyone entering the city, and doubled patrols. There would be a mandatory curfew established for all civilian personnel, and a ban on all Freelanders entering the city itself. If things went any further, to threat level Alpha, it was time for active conflict, and any Freelanders would be executed on sight. But as delicate as the situation had become, and as high as tensions would rise under threat level Bravo, the increased designation had actually increased Meridia's power. As a member of the Light Corps, threat level Bravo and higher gave her authority on par with a base commander, and only a step below a regional commander like Yosin. Still, despite her role as now the ranking combat troop in the city, and the fact that they seemed a hair's breadth away from active wartime, she found nothing but a brick wall awaiting her as she arrived for briefings.
The commander is busy in an important semi-civilian matter,
one of the high clerks answered busily. as Meridia arrived and requested immediate access to Yosin.
He's meeting with directors of the new bridge project and the community regarding the elevated threat level and new security precautions.
I need to be in that meeting, Meridia said. As ranking Light Corps officer in the city, I'm obligated to contribute in all matters regarding threat levels Bravo and above. Find me a way in. Stopping his rampant rush through paperwork, the High Clerk looked up and down, taking in the white cloak and the fierce woman who wore it. Sucking a breath in, he looked her over again and then offered a raised fist.
Hail Light Corps,
he said, bowing his head. Yeah, whatever. I told you I needed to be in that meeting, Meridia said. Where is it being held?
In the
High Clerk started, and then suddenly his eyes flicked open, and he rushed through the papers, searching for something. What? Meridia asked, at the man's sudden frantic search.
I'm sorry for the delay and the confusion. Things have been busy this morning,
he said.
I hope you forgive me. Commander Yosin has actually left special instructions for you. He has requested you for a special task force that will be for your eyes only. It's of the utmost importance, which is why he didn't want to burden you with the details of the ongoing meeting.
Meridia took a step back, nodding. Maybe the man did have some sense. Did he set a time for this special meeting? Meridia asked. Every moment of every day is important, especially in a time like this.
The commander requested that you remain in Central Command until he can meet with you,
the High Clerk said.
I apologize that I have nothing more to share.
Meridia nodded, rocking back and forth on her toes and then thanking the clerk for his help. Heading back towards one of the mess halls, she grabbed a bite of breakfast before leaving and running over the details of her task force in her head. She already had the plans laid out. It would be a two-pronged approach on both sides of the river. The Machine King was an indiscriminate, violent force who had no qualms about using Eterans or Freelanders for his needs. There would be signs, connections, clues on either side of the river. She would start with investigating the new city extensively, beginning with an appropriate probe into the prison break and then into every aspect of the attack nights prior that had left several soldiers dead and several civilians missing. The investigation had been entirely lacking, and with the people she turned over, she could ripple up the line to find any contacts who might have served the Machine King. The problems she had run into in Central had always been the limit of their jurisdiction. There was too much red tape, too big of an operation, too many people who knew. The Machine King's men were always spirited away or killed before they could actually move anything towards them or take action, and that was the frustrating part. But with the force of the Light Corps on her side, and the swift, direct authority that would come from threat level Bravo, she might have a chance of catching Krona before he could get away again. And in the old city, the risks would be great, but the benefits of preparations for wartime would pave the way to infiltrate the Freelander side of the river as well. Meridia had studied the appearances of the Machine King extensively, and it seemed that even such a specter had his limits, places where even his intangible reach was cut off, and the old city was one such dark zone. They'd always been able to stand up to him, and a few words in the right ear, an implication that there might be money or amnesty involved with sharing information about him. Well, it wasn't certain, but the dark forces that dwelled beyond Edera's doorstep might be played against each other with a delicate touch, and used for Meridia's benefit. Checking with the High Clerk again brought no news from Yosin or his meeting, so Meridia made a brief stop over to the records room to pull a few more files, and then made her way to the training grounds to offer pointers to the new recruits. The training grounds were full by that time, double refresher duty brought on by the heightened level of alert, and it was with a cool gaze that Meridia watched the familiar drilling of the younger soldiers, the practiced movements of the career military men, the tactical dueling of officers and blade masters and specialists. Despite Yosin's decision to offer Meridia a special task force, she didn't expect to be offered many choices in her selection of team members. That was another part of the game that she was used to, and so she took moments like this to scout the grounds for diamonds in the rough, men who might have passed beyond notice but still displayed enough ingenuity that they might be worth exploring as team members. It was a slow, steady process, and it was imperfect. More often than not, when she stepped into the recruit's training ground to isolate a specific trainee, or even a career man for a one-on-one session, the pressure usually got to them and they crumbled. Or they had just been lazy or terrible or confused, which could actually sometimes be mistaken for genius. Or she would match up with them and they would puff up and hem and haw and posture about the name they'd make for themselves, and those were the ones Meridia enjoyed putting down the most. But often enough, her instinct was right, and she spotted someone with a fierceness behind their eyes, an elegance to their step, a caution to their walk. She'd elevate her level quickly to dispatch them like all the rest. It was a tactic to prevent them from getting any unwanted attention. But she'd note exactly who they might be, and keep that in a mental list. It was in this way, sorting through hour after hour after hour's worth of soldiers, that the morning passed on into noon, and then beyond midday towards the evening, all without another word from Yosen. Long waits were nothing particularly new in the Edoran military. In fact, hurry up and wait was a way of life when it came to a career in the Edoran colors. But it pissed off Meridia all the same. Maybe it was the fact that Meridia had gotten used to a certain level of priority as a member of the Light Corps, or the fact that Yosen's stinging comments from the day before still rang in her head. Either way, as the sun began to hang low in the sky, it took all of Meridia's self-control to dutifully stride back to the High Clerk at the front of command. There, once again, she requested her pressing audience with the High Commander, invoking her right as Light Corps to assume involvement in any military matters when threat levels were at Bravo or higher. It was the most delicate military way to say, "Get me my fucking meeting." And maybe it was the fact that the clerks had changed shift, or maybe it was the fact that Meridia had let her frustration out on the last few soldiers, and had blood splattered over her knuckles and across one side of her coat. Either way, she finally received the response that the situation warranted. With a hasty bow, the clerk raced off towards some of the officers' quarters, then zipped back towards the other end, towards the entry hall, before finally arriving back at Meridia.
The High Commander will see you now in the gardens,
he said.
He is awaiting you.
Meridia breezed past him. That was rich. The commander waiting her when she'd been sat out here all day? Maybe the old fucker would like to see exactly what it took to get qualified for the Light Corps. Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edera and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.